Norse mythology is just so dramatic and powerful, and there's a reason it's been so popular throughout the centuries since. And she says, basically, listen, I'm going to tell you about the creation of the world, and then I'm going to tell you about the destruction at Ragnarök.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is approximately the year 1200 AD. A man is in a tavern, having a very good time, drinking heavily. And suddenly he gets a message written in runes on a piece of wood. The message is very clear. Gyda says that you should go home. How he responds to this is unknown, but he does write a message in return that, I'm told by the author, Eleanor Barraclough, doesn't make any sense. However, we forgive him for being inebriated. Thus, we're into the world that Eleanor takes on in her new book, Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. You just heard one. Who's Gyda, and how much trouble is he in? Eleanor, your book is wonderful. Congratulations. Your reading of your book is even more wonderful. I felt when you read about Gyda and her beloved, you were having an especially good time. What is that he was reading, the rune carvings, and how do you interpret them? Because they're symbols, they're like pictures. Good evening to you.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your kind words. This is one of my favorite bits of the book. It's fabulous. And we've all, well, I suspect most of us have either received text messages saying, yeah, where are you? When are you coming home? Or tried to send ones back. And these runes, I mean, we're familiar with the form. They're these spiky letters, and they had to be spiky because they were carved for the most part into hard surfaces like stone, in this case wood, sometimes bone, sometimes human bone even. There's one episode where I talk about a skull, a piece of human skull that's been carved with runes from Denmark. But these ones are, if we think of them, sometimes they feel quite familiar. There are letter forms that look almost like the Latin alphabet. And this isn't necessarily a coincidence, because one possibility is that these runes actually originated in the time of the Roman Empire, where even though Scandinavia wasn't part of that empire, there was still lots of cultural contact and people were traveling south and being part of that empire. And by the time you get to Gyda in around 1200, and here we're in Norway, we're in Denmark, here we're in Norway, in Bergen, and down by the waterfront, we have lots of these runic messages being carved, often on little pieces of wood. And these slivers of wood, they're not meant to be things that lots of people would see. They're private messages, and that's the context in which Gyda's writing. And as you say, we can't tell for sure, but it looks quite likely that she's basically telling her husband, who's down in the tavern getting drunk in the pub, to come home. So her side is actually quite easy to read. These rune forms are quite precise, and if we transliterate them into sort of Old Norse, in a way that I can then read out more easily, it's Gia sayer at du kak heim. So Gira says that you should go home. But yes, the other side, where perhaps he's tried to carve his own response, is completely unintelligible. It's just a series of lines. I'd love to think that actually, from his point of view, he thought he was coming up with something really clever, and he thought, yeah, this will be fine. This will buy me another pint. But yeah, we'll never know.
The methodology is now evident. How Eleanor Barraclough has put this book together. She needs an object, and the object has to be found in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's sticking up in a field. Oftentimes it's out of a grave that people discovered when they were digging a road. Sometimes it's at the bottom of a pit. These are pieces left over from a lifestyle and a time that is not easily available, except for we've moved it into myth and movie characters. But this book talks about the real lives of the people who sometimes are called Vikings. They're also from Scandinavia. They're also called the rowers. They're called many names at the time. They weren't divided up into nations. Eleanor is an historian, and therefore she needs to work with evidence. She's also based at Spa University, and she presents lecturing material here. But the magic of these objects is everything to me. And when I saw how you were working, Eleanor, I thought, this is a very careful way of putting history in context. Is that the way the Vikings in general are approached because we have these objects? It's like you pick them up and you start to say, now, what does this mean? Is that how it works for you?
It's how it works for me now, but my background is I started with Old Norse language and literature. That was what I did my PhD in, for example. So I was looking at that relationship between the stories that the Norse told about themselves and about the world and how that fits into the history. But when I was doing that, the little bits and pieces that I just kept casting my eye onto, the ones you can just see on the edge of your vision, your peripheral vision, were these extraordinary, as you say, sort of everyday objects. And because the Norse cultural sphere is so vast, they start in Scandinavia, but the Viking Age is partly characterized by the spread of this diaspora all the way, certainly to kind of up to Arctic Scandinavia, but then across the North Atlantic. They settle Greenland. They end up on the edge of the North American continent. Then east, they go down the Eurasian waterways and steppes to Byzantium, even the Islamic Caliphate. And so that's a really big story on a really big stage. And it's quite hard to find the individuals within those stories. And I think that's why I just kept coming back to the little bits and pieces, that sort of the ephemera. And that's where the title comes from. That's where Embers of the Hands comes from. It's a kenning, which is a sort of Old Norse sort of poetic device. They used it to describe one thing by dressing it up in flowery language and referring to something else. And so Embers of the Hands originally means gold. But I wanted to think of something that was precious in a different way, something that's sort of personal and sort of in a way much more ordinary. And those were the bits I connected to because they're much more human in a way.
Let's do some timeline, Eleanor, to fix the Viking Age, because 1200 is a little beyond an ordinary assumption of the age of Vikings. I have 750 to 1100, and in 793 we have the first instance. This is a smashing instance, the raid at Lindisfarne. What was Lindisfarne, and what was driving the raid?
So Lindisfarne is the first big raid we know about. There might have been others. There seems to have been some sort of altercation down on the south coast of England a couple of years earlier, also involving 3 boats of the Danes, but it's not a raid and it's not attacking a monastery. And this is why Lindisfarne is so shocking, because Lindisfarne is also known as Holy Island even today, and it's a tidal island, so you can get across on the causeway when the tide is low. It's off the coast of Northumberland in northeast England, and sort of going back to sort of the beginning of the 8th century and even earlier, Lindisfarne was sort of a fabulous, very rich, very powerful monastery. And one thing we might know it for is the Lindisfarne Gospels, this incredible ornate Gospels, with all these beautiful illustrations, illuminated letters, gold, lots of beautiful colours, which tells us something about how rich this monastery was. And that's important because when the Vikings attack the monastery in 793 AD, this sends shockwaves throughout Europe. People are writing letters to saying that, never before has such a terror appeared on these shores. Behold this horror coming out of the north, these pagan people. And so it is shocking. And It's not the only raid, though. So the year afterwards, they attack a bit further down the coast on another monastery. They attack all the way around the coast. They attack. So again, we're talking like the last decade of the 8th century. They attack off the coast of Ireland as well. And so it is something that is new, certainly in terms of how it's described in the annals, in the letters, in the textual sources of the time. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is written later, but looking back to that time, describes it as that this attack on Lindisfarne as being sort of you start to see sheets of lightning in the sky and fiery dragons, and there's a terrible famine, and then suddenly the Norse attack. And so it's quite a convenient way of thinking about something that defines the start of this period, even though, of course, as I say in the book, everything comes from somewhere. It's not like a series of canal locks where we can say, okay, now we're in this period. It's more complicated than that, but it is an important date and it's an important time to focus on because something new is happening at that time.
The book is Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. Eleanor Barraclough is the author. We have the Vikings as raiders, but what about as conquerors? Quickly now, the Carolingian Empire is falling apart in mainland Europe. The Vikings are very good raiders, and they do very well. They raid Paris, and Eleanor reports that they walked away with 7,000 pounds of gold. Good God. At the same time, they decide to bring an army and conquer England. East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia all fall, only Wessex holds out. So you're English, Eleanor, but you're Norse. Is that it? Is this your origin story in the United Kingdom?
So the thing with the United Kingdom is there are so many origin stories, and that's what makes it such a fascinating melting pot of cultural influences and incomers. I mean, the Anglo-Saxons are sort of what we tend to characterize these kingdoms at the time of the sort of Norse incursions, as you say, this proper, more military conquest style invasion. But of course, the Anglo-Saxons themselves are different cultural groups that have come over to England a few centuries earlier. Before then, it's the Romans, so it's much more interesting, and it's much more complicated, that sort of melting pot. But certainly, yes, what's sometimes called the Great Heathen Army, that like Mitchell Haraldhardrada in Old English, arrives in around 865. And it's been suggested that actually, rather than thinking of it as one big invading force, it's more useful to think of it as smaller mobile war bands with different leaders, which makes it much more possible for them to essentially, nip in through the waterways. They can overwinter, and then they can keep going inland, they have then the element of surprise. They can also sort of split up. Some can head north, some can head south. And that makes it much more difficult to predict what's going to happen. And that seems to be the case. As you say, kingdoms start to topple. And then you end up with this very interesting situation where we have to bring in Alfred the Great, as he's later known, so King Alfred. And he ends up essentially, there are other people about. So, the problem is that the main textual sources for the time, particularly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, is written very much from Alfred's perspective. So, of course, he's going to make sure everyone knows just how important he was. But even so, there's truth in that. We get to the point where he is the only, or his sort of, his forces are the only ones that are able to defeat the Norse invaders under one of the leaders who's called Guthrum. And Alfred and Guthrum make peace, and they draw up this astonishing agreement. And we're talking sort of around, I don't know, 878, 880 going up. It's sort of towards the end of the 9th century. And it's not Guthrum and the Norse, the Vikings, the Scandinavians, they're all going to leave. It's more of a stalemate. And so what they decide is that the Norse will actually control, legally, politically, a vast swathe of England. So East Anglia, going up to the north, what's now Yorkshire, all the way up towards Northumberland. And that's going to be the area that later on becomes known as the Danelaw. It's the area that's under Norse control and Norse sort of legal procedures. And we see that in place names today. You have in that area that they controlled and they settled in, because they take over farms, they start to settle with their families, they're living alongside the people who lived there before. We start to see lots of place names that have old Norse influences in them, and that's a really interesting way of tracking settlement, which is very different to raiding, where obviously they're not going to leave that linguistic imprint in the landscape itself.
I'm speaking with Eleanor Barraclough, and we're talking about the Viking Age. But the Viking Age has a lot of moving parts, and one I wanted to attend to just momentarily, Eleanor. The Russ, meaning rowers. Now, the eastern part of Scandinavia, which we now think of as Sweden and Finland, they moved down the three great rivers of Eurasia, the Volga, the Dnieper, and the one other. Uh, and and they move all the way down to Kiev. And so what we have in Russia right now is a contest between men and women who are descended from the same people that England is descended from, all mixed up with other parts of Eurasia. Yes, admittedly, it's been several 1,000 years. But is that correct? The Vikings went in two directions. They went west and they went south.
Yeah, they absolutely did go in lots of different directions. And more recent archaeological evidence points to the the early dawn of the Viking Age in a way being as much the story of this eastern expansion or eastern movement as west, if not more so. The really interesting thing is, so we have, exactly as you say, we have people from the area, that's now Sweden, that led by someone called Rurik, who comes from, what is now Sweden. He comes all the way to Novgorod, and he's said to settle there in 862. And this is often seen as sort of the major starting point in, say, sort of in the history of the area, how it then kind of politically develops from that.
Just a moment, Eleanor. We come back because you're making an important 21st century point.
Yes.
Eleanor Barraclough is the author of Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. Eleanor is helping us understand that the Vikings, who have this very large reputation in America because they got to North America, they got to Greenland in the news, they got to Iceland always in the news, they got to England, yes, of course, but they also reached all the way into what is now Russia and Eastern Europe. Eleanor, please continue. You had them at Novgorod around the middle of the ninth century.
Yeah, so pretty similar, just a couple of years before this great heathen army lands in England, there is Rurik and his company in Novgorod in 862. This then becomes the starting point for what becomes known as Kievan Rus as a sort of cultural group. But the reason it becomes known as Kievan Rus is that a couple of decades later, their power base shifts south to Kiev. But what's really interesting is that although you have people of Norse descent and Norse heritage very much controlling this cultural area early on, they're always a minority. And there are lots of other Slavic groups in particular who are very much operating within this cultural sphere. And so what you end up with, a bit like sort of elsewhere in the Norse world, in the Norse diaspora, you end up with a cultural melting pot where you have Scandinavian elements, you have Slavic elements, and you have all sorts of other elements there too. And what you find is that the Norse are, in a way, masters of cultural assimilation. And so before too long, you see names, sort of in the rulers, for example, that we might think of as being quite Slavic. So Igor and Olga, which actually sound very Slavic, but they come from Norse, their Ingvar and their Helga. But what you then find is that these people are naming their children with Slavic names like Sviatoslav. And Sviatoslav, when he becomes ruler of Kiev and Rus, he's very, very Slavic, and he worships the Slavic gods Peron and Volos, who are the gods of thunder and lightning and the herds. And he even says, so what you find is over time, the Norse elements, it's not that they disappear, but they are part of something much greater. And so it isn't the case of either or. The whole point is that part of the world, which now we think of as that sort of quite tricky, politically and culturally tricky line, as we, is very much sort of in the news at the moment, Russia, Ukraine, and all that area going down. It's always been sort of double facing, almost sort of Janus like, and very culturally mixed. And that means, in a way, that people can attach their versions of history to what they want to be true, which is always the dangerous thing with history, that, it's as much a reflection of our own times and our own opinions as a reflection of what was actually going on hundreds of years ago.
Yes, you say history is flexible. Let's stay east. One of the great mysteries that I've come across in my lifetime, you introduce. We're in Estonia, which is the Baltic states, now alarm bells ringing in the 21st century. Well, sometime in the 8th century, something happened there that Eleanor is going to introduce, but it's a complete mystery to me. And I appeal to her for help, but her book is filled with explanations, and not this one. This remains unsolved. We need Poirot on this one. All right.
Yeah, this one is extraordinary, not least because it's so recently discovered. This is something that changes the parameters of the Viking Age, potentially. It changes our idea of sort of how things started, but in a way that, I mean, these were discovered in 2013. This is such new evidence. It's essentially on this island of Saaremaa. It's near somewhere called Salme, so they were often known as the Salme ships. And it's ship burials, which seems like a very Viking thing in a way. It's this idea that you put the ship into the ground, you put the dead person or dead people in it, you cover it with a mound, and there's your funeral. And here we have dozens of people all buried with great care and with some incredible grave goods, beautiful swords, gaming pieces, hunting dogs, falcons, in all sorts. And they're just all lined together in rows and buried. And then next to this big ship, there's another burial of 6 people in a smaller, almost like a sort of, glorified rowing boat. And what's interesting about them is that these people are actually buried as if they're still at the oars of this boat. Now, because of DNA evidence, archaeologists were able to work out where these people came from. And where they came from was Sweden, around Lake Mälaren, so sort of close to what's now Stockholm. And that's all interesting enough. But then we add the date, and the date is around 750. Now, if we remember Lindisfarne, that's not that attack on the northeast coast of England in that sumptuous, very rich monastery. That's 793. So these people died decades before, and they're also of Scandinavian origin. And we know they died violently, not least because the side of their ship is all peppered with arrows that's gone in. So they've been attacked. And it looks like they're not a raiding party because, for a start, they're bringing really beautiful high status stuff. You're not going to do that if you're just going on a summer raid. They're bringing hundreds of gaming pieces. Again, you might have a board. You're not going to have many boards. And they also have things like, they're hunting dogs and falcons and, other birds of prey. You don't take that sort of stuff on a raiding party. So what it's been suggested is that they are heading on a diplomatic mission. And they're heading to the east, maybe to open up trading links with the cultures who are there further east, which then explains some of the context to when Rurik and other sort of leaders of what becomes known as Kiev and Rus, it explains that context in which they are then settling and taking power even further east than that. Now, the question is, who buried them? And why were they allowed to bury them with such dignity and with such care, which takes time? And that's where the mystery comes in. And it's, were they attacked by local Estonians? Were they attacked by other groups living in what's now Sweden? So if they're Sviar, one group, then were they maybe attacked by the Götar or the Geats? So there is a mystery there. But it's also an act of storytelling because one of the people who's buried, and he seems to be the most high status of the people who's buried, so probably their leader, is buried with the king piece of a gaming set that seems to have been placed in his mouth. So I describe it in the book almost like an Agatha Christie murder mystery. It's a man with a gaming piece, a king gaming piece in his mouth. That's something very specific that we're being told there.
Oh, explain the game. Hnefatafl.
Hnefatafl, yes. It's terrible. I'm sure even the Norse struggle to say that. It's a really difficult word. So it's a board game, and it's one of the board games that were very popular during the Viking Age. Now, if we think of board games and we think of sort of Viking Age, then we might be more likely to think of, those wonderful, very iconic pieces such as the Lewis chess pieces, with their very grumpy, they're all made from ivory and, you've got the queen with her head in her hands looking very fed up, and you've got the berserker warriors biting their shields and all the rest of it. But actually, that's not so much of a feature of the Viking Age. This is something that comes later. It was Hnefatafl that was very popular. And what you essentially have is you imagine a grid and you have the king piece in the middle. And often you find boards with a little sort of depression in the middle, which is where the king piece would have sat. And then round the king are his guards, his warriors. And the idea is that whoever controls the king and his guards has to get the king to the edge of the board, probably. And of course, the other person is there with other pieces trying to stop that from happening. And what I really, really love about this game is that some of the most exquisite artifacts from the Viking Age come from Hnefatafl board games, or rather the pieces. So you have beautiful ones made out of curled, twisting coloured glass that you find in burials, in very high status burials, or gnarled ones made from whalebone and walrus ivory you find up in Iceland. But you also find very everyday boards that look like essentially someone's just scratched them on to the stone. And there you don't find the gaming pieces because, well, you wouldn't really recognize them. They probably find people use bones or stones, whatever they could get hold of. And so it's one of these games that you see being played at the top of society, but also throughout the Norse world, all the way down at the bottom of that society too.
I'm speaking with Eleanor Barraclough. Her book is Embers of the Hands, which is Viking poetry for gold. Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. We've been dealing with a mystery that's not solved. Those pieces of the game, Hnefatafl, are spread throughout the boat. They're scattered around. They're extremely valuable and would appeal to any young person. And the care that they were buried in this boat, and they left the jeweled swords behind. They left, and they were buried with falcons and hawks and dogs. You say that's high status animals, not just sacrificed pigs. A diplomatic mission wiped out by locals? That seems far-fetched. I wasn't ready to accept that. Do you?
See, I think maybe not locals because locals might not have been happy to let the survivors bury their dead, which would have taken time. So I wonder whether it's sort of other Swedish groups who are sort of also patrolling those waters and don't necessarily want their rivals to open up trade routes and diplomatic links further east. That, who knows? Maybe I would say we're never going to know, but we didn't know
Yeah.
this existed 10 years ago.
I know there'll be more found.
Yeah.
Eleanor, we need to turn to one more example of mysteries, which is the reliquaries and what they
Mm.
tell us that have been discovered. Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. Eleanor Barraclough is the author. These reliquaries were found in graves, and they're part of a collection that is associated in Eleanor's telling with a place called Malhus, and the burial mounds give up grave uh, grave treasures that you then interpret. One of the things that comes immediately when you find a reliquary is that this is a high status and you presume female. What else do we read from the reliquaries, Eleanor?
So, to really think about the significance of reliquaries and where they're found, we have to think about where they came from. And this takes us back in a way to those first raids on monasteries such as Lindisfarne, because a reliquary was initially something that, very much within a Christian context, would have been used to house little bits and pieces of sort of the saints or sort of other things associated with sort of the sort of highest, holiest levels of sort of Christian belief. And this meant that they were beautifully decorated, beautiful patterns and a lot of metal and other decorative items, which are significant because, of course, within a Christian context, for the monks, what really mattered was inside. And how the outside was decorated was just a reflection of the importance of what was inside. But of course, the problem comes when you get the Norse raiders and they're not interested in what's inside. And in fact, annals often say, the Norse attacked and they took the reliquaries and they shook the relics from the reliquaries. They don't care about that. What they care about is the metal and the jewels and the decoration. And that's why it looks like they do end up being taken back across the North Sea to Norway in particular and given to women as presents. It's almost like, look, this is what I got on my holidays for you. It's what you find then is that these reliquaries, when they are complete, get passed down the generations by females. You have one that even has someone's name written on the bottom of it in runes. She's scratched her name because this thing is so important. But even if you didn't get a whole reliquary, you might get a little bit of a reliquary. You might get a beautiful piece of metalwork, which you could then repurpose as a brooch, for example. And this is really important because when we think about those original raids, it's a masculine activity. These are males for the most part who are going to be raiding. But when we think about why they're raiding, we have to think about who's on the other side of the North Sea waiting for them and why are they bothering to take these beautiful items home. And the suggestion is actually a lot of these early raids are about young males who are essentially trying to get wealth and status. And so they can take it back and find someone who wants to marry them, set up a house, a farmstead with them, have children, have descendants if they're lucky. And so it's within that context that we have to open up that picture and think on who's on the other side of the North Sea.
And a detail that you provide, they valued male children, not female children. Did they abandon women on the mountains the way the Greeks did?
So it has been suggested that there was, yeah, as you say, sort of female infanticide. It's really tricky to prove that it was specifically female infanticide because what are you going to see that tells us that's definitely the case? But yes, the argument is that that fits with the picture of essentially these young males having to go off because they have to find ways of making sure they're the ones that end up with the women when they come back. And if there aren't enough women to go round, or maybe there are higher status men who have married more than one woman, then that increases the pressure. And that might explain what's going on.
We've now done two of the three beginnings that Eleanor features, which is a way of talking about the culture without just talking about violence. The third is important here because the reliquaries are post-Christian somewhere, but pre-Christian somewhere are superstitions that are also attached to runes. And Eleanor takes another object, which is a piece of a human skull with a hole in it, drilled from the inside, so after death. And on it are runes. One rune in particular mentions dwarves. What did the dwarf mean to them?
So it depends. There are two ways of thinking about this. Dwarves, in the sense of sort of a mythological being, are very much something that, along with other supernatural beings, such as elves, perhaps demons, are things that can cause malevolence, cause sickness. It's been suggested even that, yes, in the case of this piece of skull that has runes carved on it, this might have been a sort of protective amulet against sickness caused by dwarves in this case. Um, and it's something where you find this. So this skull fragment, the human skull fragment, is very unusual because of that. It's found in the very earliest layers, really, of sort of archaeologically what we might think of as the dawn of the Viking Age. It's from Ribe, which is in Denmark. Which was the first sort of major sort of international trading emporium in what became the Viking Age world. And it's found sort of from the early decades of the 8th
Yes, this
century. So
is
again,
the Jutland Peninsula, the west side.
yeah, yeah. Exactly, exactly. And so, they're very well connected. We have to think of all the sea and land routes. It's the perfect place for an emporium that's bringing in lots of sort of different cultural, international connections. But we see amulets like these going on for centuries, where people are saying things like, I'm cowering in the soot, I have festering sores, protect me from the tremblers, protect me from the elves, all these. So it's this sense that there is an unseen world that can influence you and influence your body, influence your fate. In a way, it's sort of, for me, it makes sense. If you replace the word elf or dwarf with, the word germ or virus or bacteria, it's just a different way of conceptualizing it. And it's a really interesting way of trying to get into that Norse mentality.
Yes, and the skull would have been carried on a string, I imagine, over around a neck to protect somebody. We have about 30 seconds.
Yeah, so that's the idea. But what's interesting is we don't see any evidence of marks that would actually suggest it had ever been worn. Maybe it was dropped in the marketplace before they could actually use it.
So we're looking at somebody's left behind rune collection that was never used, maybe just purchased.
Possibly.
Although buying a piece of human skull strikes me as, well, anyway, the book is Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. Importantly, Eleanor works with objects. And once the object is found, sometimes in burial mounds, sometimes buried, sometimes just turns up in a field, you then need to interpret it. And in this particular instance, 750 to 1100 AD, we're interpreting the culture that we generally call the Viking Age. But it's about Scandinavians who initially migrate east and south into what is now Russia and Ukraine, and west, England, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, Orkneys, Shetlands, all those islands in the north, and then they spread down into England and conquer England. All of that is a culture, and its roots are in magic. And Eleanor introduces us to the way they conceived the world, which is pre-Christian. Although, importantly, Eleanor, you emphasize, congratulations again, you emphasize that these stories are told post-Christian conversion, and therefore we need to be cautious entirely about what was feared and what the fears meant.
Mm.
Please explain.
So this is one of the really interesting, occasionally frustrating, but definitely interesting things about looking at sort of Viking Age belief, Norse belief systems, mythology, that if you want something that is written internally, sort of within the Norse diaspora, apart from runes, which sort of are really useful, but also are sort of relatively limited, you have to look past the conversion to Christianity because that's when the accoutrements of writing essentially make their way into Norse culture. And so, really, we're talking 13th century. For the most part, we're talking Iceland, and our main sources for Norse mythology are the poet and politician Snorri Sturluson, who writes what we now call the Prose Edda. It's essentially a handbook for poets because poets, even though they're now Christian, they still need to be able to access the Norse myths, which are connected so strongly to their poetic practice. And then there's another text, and it only survives in one manuscript, and we know it as the Poetic Edda. And it's the series of poems about, the gods and the heroes such as Sigurd and Brynhilde, made so famous once again by Wagner in his Ring Cycle. And that only survives, yeah, in one manuscript, also from the 13th century. And that's really useful, except as you say, we're looking at it through a Christian framework. It doesn't mean that there aren't valuable things to be gleaned from it. Absolutely not. But it does mean we have to be cautious because we're dealing with a gap of several hundred years. And that's why it's really interesting to combine the texts with what we know from archaeological sources, from the material evidence, because the material evidence comes from the time itself. Now, the problem there is, you don't tend to have a label where someone says, okay, this is the point of this, and this is why, I left this artifact, and this is what I was doing with it. And it's even harder when we're talking about belief, because, how can you really access something so personal and internal? But we can look at what we can tell from rituals, from things that are left over in the world that might give us clues as to what was going on and what people believed.
Yes, let's begin with the belief that we can vaguely recognize, which is where did we come from and where are we going?
Yeah,
Ice,
so
fire, Muspelheim and
yes.
Niflheim. What do they represent?
Yeah, so this is one. I mean, Norse mythology is just so dramatic and powerful, and there's a reason it's been so popular throughout the centuries since. So, and comes very much from Snorri Sturluson. It also comes from one of the poems from the Poetic Edda called Voluspa, which means the seeress's prophecy. And she says, basically, listen, I'm going to tell you about the creation of the world, and then I'm going to tell you about the destruction at Ragnarök. And it's so powerful. And yeah, so the idea is that in the beginning there was nothing, only Ginnungagap, the eternal void. But then there were worlds, and there was the world of Muspelheim, the world of fire. And then there's the world of ice, Niflheim, and where the heat from the world of fire meets the icy rivers from the world of ice, there life starts to form. And initially it forms as sort of the primordial ice giants called Ymir. And eventually, Ymir, his whole body will shape the world that we live in. So his skull becomes the sky, and his blood becomes the rivers, and his bones become the rocks. And that's the start of the world, according to Norse pagan mythology. And then we fast forward in time to the end of Voluspa, and we have Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the twilight of the gods, where the world essentially ends in fire. And this terrifying fire giant called Surtur, whose name sort of just basically means black, because of these fiery connotations. He comes with his flaming swords, ready to destroy the world, and the gods are there fighting with the giants and fighting with the dead. And Loki, the trickster, comes from hell with, and this is my favorite detail, a ship made from the nails of dead people. And this is a detail I think in Snorri, he says, so always cut the fingernails of the dead before you bury them, because if their fingernails are too long, this ship, Naglfar, is going to be built faster. And once the ship is built, Ragnarok comes. So I just, there's something about that detail that is so creepy and so wonderful.
Snorri Sturluson lived late 12th century, early 13th century, and he was murdered, is the
He
story. Do
was,
you accept
yes.
the murder?
Yes, absolutely. So Snorri lived in a politically very turbulent time. The 13th century in Iceland was a time of bloody civil war. There's a set of sagas we call the contemporary sagas, which means they're talking about the 13th century, which is the time in which they're written. They're called Sturlungasagur. I've got them all behind me up here on the shelf, and they essentially read like war reports, and they're very they're very disturbing a lot of the time. You know, we see house burnings, we see feuds where many people are killed. We have eyewitness accounts of what happens. But Snorri, within that context, is a major player, and he's actually killed. So it's a time when Iceland has up to this point been independent. The King of Norway wants to take over Iceland. Some of the leading figures in Iceland really like that idea because they think they'll have even more power if they have the King of Norway on their side. And so Snorri ends up being something of an international politician until he falls foul of the Norwegian king and he's murdered in his own basement on the orders of the Norwegian king. And according to the sagas, his last words are Ekki högva, which means don't strike. And the response is högva, strike. And he's killed.
We're going to stay in Iceland because we're going to go into another world beneath the ground. The book is Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. Eleanor Barraclough is the author, who reads her book brilliantly. And we're now going to go into another mystery that is extremely scary. It's a cave, a lava cave, on Iceland, I believe, called Surt. And in that cave is a belief system. Let's descend into the cave. I'm presuming you haven't yet, Eleanor. If you have, I want to hear about it.
No, I'm desperate to. I haven't. The archaeologists who've been, exploring this cave system, they're wonderful. I've had some incredible conversations with them, and I'm just itching for them to take me in. I'm not sure if it's going to happen, but essentially, this is a bit like when we're talking about Estonia, and this is evidence that has only recently come to light. The same is true of this cave. It's called Surtshellir. And Hellir is just the word for cave. Surtur is this fire giant who appears at Ragnarök. Now, we can't trace the name Surtshellir back to the time when what's happening in the cave is happening. So that's important to say. But certainly that association between this fire giant and this lava field and what's underneath the lava field does come fairly early. And so it is also a possibility that that is exactly what is going on. So when the archaeologists first found this cave, which is in this Hatlmundarhraun, this huge lava field from this eruption, this volcanic eruption that took place in around 900, when the archaeologists first found the cave, they thought maybe it was somewhere that outlaws had been hiding out. I remember speaking to the archaeologist. I said, well, what gave you the clue that it might not be outlaws? He said, well, there was no poo. And of course, if you've got humans living there for a long time, you expect to see a lot of sort of evidence of organic human activity. And that's not the case here. And what's actually seems to be happening is even more extraordinary than an outlaw hideout. Because if you go deep, deep, deep into the cave, like through kilometers, like miles into this lava field, you find first a wall, a huge wall that someone has built deep under the ground in the pitch black. And then past the wall, you find, I think it's 7 huge piles of unburned animal bones, like absolutely enormous, meters across. And then you keep going. And what the archaeologists found was what appears to be sort of stones made in the shape of a boat. So it's almost like, you imagine the outline of a boat. And then on the other side of that boat, and this is important, the cave continues. But inside the boat, people had been leaving offerings. And all the offerings they were leaving are things that are associated with fire and with burning. So it's orpiment and it's fire starters like jasper and it's burnt bones and it's glass, that's obviously born of great heat as well. And so the archaeologists started to think that there's something else going on here. And what they now think is that people were leaving offerings possibly to the fire giant or the fire being that they felt dwelled beyond this stone boat outline further into the lava field. And what then happens is Iceland converts to Christianity officially in around the year 1000. Nice, easy date to remember. A couple of decades after that, the final offerings are left in the middle of this stone boat. And this time, one of those offerings is a metal cross. And so what they think is happening is that someone comes for the last time to leave the final offering and leave that fire being by themselves deep under the lava field. And so it's this sense that, okay, are they leaving offerings to try and placate whatever being they think caused the volcanic eruption? This was the first major eruption that the Icelanders would have witnessed after they settled Iceland, starting sort of about 30 years before the volcano went off. And so is that what we're seeing? Just now and again, people are visiting this cave deep under the ground, under the lava field, and leaving offerings to whatever beings are there underneath the ground.
If they imagine this as a meeting place between the two worlds, do those worlds comport with the fire and ice? Is that what they're thinking?
I wonder that. Yes, I think that's a really beautiful way of thinking about it because it is. It's this sort of liminal space of sort of productivity in a way. It's a space of meeting, and we find within, yeah, I'd say within sort of like the belief structures that we can access, we find this idea of liminality again and again. So one of the earliest things, in fact, I open it with the prologue, is offerings in a bog in Denmark that are being left sort of hundreds of years before what we think of as the start of the Viking Age. You know, if we think of the 8th century, we're talking back sort of, the first century, second century. And but it's this idea once again that people are leaving offerings to the beings who are on the other side, and in this case, the other side of the water, and in the case of the lava field, on the other side of that boat. And it's what you find in the middle of that that's so sort of uncertain and so wonderful.
There's a poem that describes violence, flames, and the end. The question is, the end of what? And Eleanor, your interpretation, or a interpretation of this, is that it's not about the cave, it's about the end of the world. Do I read that correctly?
Yeah, so this is the poem. It's preserved in a later saga, and the story, so kind of 13th, 14th century, and the story goes that there were two men sheltering in a cave from a winter snowstorm.
This is a
And
terrific story. It's a
oh, it's
terrific story.
wonderful, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, seriously, the sagas are, for pure storytelling magic, there's nothing that beats the sagas. And this is sort of, post conversion. So they trace a Christian cross with their knife and they perch close to the entrance. And I can just imagine, how you'd feel in the middle of this snowstorm. And then the story goes that they see two glowing eyes the size of full moons that appear at the back of the cave. And this is, so the story goes, a mountain giant, of the sort that maybe is under the ground in Surtshellir. And the mountain giant starts to say a poem, and it's full of fire and volcanic imagery and mythology. And part of it says dark flames drive the spit, split the mountain ridge, embers shoot rushing upward, the roaring of the spark storm. It's just pure volcanic imagery. But there are 12 verses, I think, to this poem, and as it goes on, it's the end of this world. It's the end of, possibly not the end of sort of the world in a physical sense, but the end of a way of life. And in this case, the end of a pagan way of life, possibly. Or maybe it is describing Ragnarok, but it's essentially saying, we're all being driven underground, I'll fight anyone, but I'm going down northwards, down the hell road, down to the underworld. And it's this idea that essentially the clay folk, these giants, are gathering together in the darkness because the end of their world has come, and now it's a new Christian world order. And so it's that wonderful way of, that the Norse mythology does so beautifully, where it combines sort of the physicality of the world, which, I mean, in Iceland is this dramatic world of ice and fire, with the worlds in people's heads, and the mythological creatures that are conjured out of our imaginations.
The book is Embers of the Hands. It talks about the Viking Age, roughly 750 AD to 1100 AD, but both sides. There's no certainty here. because the magic of the Viking Age collides with the magic of the Christian conversion process. We're now going to the geography, and the geography includes a big battle, a big battle, and a graveyard. That is a way of talking about the endings. We begin with the big battle in 1066. Harold of England, Harold of Norway, and William of Normandy. We need to establish, Eleanor, that Normandy is as Norse as anything in England, correct? And
Yeah, absolutely.
Rollo was the founder of Normandy. So we're talking about the the Vikings in at war with the Vikings.
Yes, pretty much. Yeah, so Norman literally means Northmen. What's interesting is it's a bit like when we were talking about further east. What often happens when the Norse settle in an area is that they assimilate culturally really quickly. And so by the time of William the Conqueror, as he, is shortly to become in our narrative, they are not they're not Norse in that way. They don't speak the language. But having said that, if you look at the Bayeux Tapestry and how the Normans are depicted there, their hairstyles are the hairstyles that we associate with the Scandinavian settlers. So it's sort of like short at the back, long and shaggy at the front. If you look at the Bayeux Tapestry, that's exactly what you see there for the Normans.
1066 is a convenient place to say this is when the Viking Age ends and we transform into the modern age, the last 1,000 years. There are problems with that, however. Who was Harald Hardrada?
So Harald Hardrada is, I think we might say, something of a footnote in sort of the history of Britain, in that we know him from 1066 when he's killed by Harold Godwinson, who at that point is King of England, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which is just outside York. But Harald Hardrada is King of Norway, and he's had the most extraordinary, rich, and dramatic life up to this point. He spent much of his youth in the Byzantine capital, Constantinople, where he was one of the emperor's personal bodyguards, possibly even the leader of the bodyguards, if we're to believe him. And in fact, that kenning, Embers of the Hands, which I take the title of the book from, comes from a verse that is connected to Harold himself. So he does the emperor a great service and he's rewarded with embers of the hands, which in his case means he's rewarded with gold and silver and treasure. But Harald Hardrada, or Hardraudi, as he is known in Old Norse, it means hard ruler. He comes back to Norway and he becomes a very sort of successful king. What he wants to do, though, is retake the English throne for Norway. And this is because he comes from a context in which King Knut, going back to sort of 1018, 1016, is creating this North Sea Empire, which is England, Denmark, and parts of Norway. And so this is essentially, in essence, Harold's claim to the English throne as he sees it. But of course, there are two other contenders famously for that throne: Harold Godwinson, who is on the throne at that point, and William of Normandy, who we know eventually is the one to triumph at Hastings. So Harold Godwinson, or at least his army, they kill Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And this is all very richly described in great detail in Harold's saga, because he has his own saga written down in Iceland a couple of centuries later. The Icelanders are very fond of Harald Hardrada because he helps them out during a famine. And so this date, 1066, has often been used as this is the end of the Viking Age, because Harald Hardrada is this larger than life figure that in many ways represents much of what the Viking Age was about. But there's also a problem here, which is that, a little like Lindisfarne back in 793, taking 1066 is an incredibly Anglo-centric way of looking at the end of any historical period, but particularly for a diaspora that spread all the way from Greenland to Ukraine, Russia, as they are now. And so even if we go north across what's now the border into Scotland, already that date is fairly meaningless. And what's going on there continues to go on for centuries. So I'm not saying we should throw the date out completely. It's an important date in many ways, but it comes back to this problem of, well, how do we define historical eras? And if we define them just in relation to the great rulers and when they're killed, then we lose a lot of the subtlety of history.
Everything's happening around 1,000, though. It's a strange synchronicity. The conversion process, the Battle of
Yeah.
Hastings, even you provide the background to the Battle of Hastings, which starts with Harald Bluetooth
So
and to his son Canute. That's happening in Norway. Is that where that's happening?
So Harald Bluetooth is in Denmark, and he's a really important figure. But we have to. He's back sort of quite a few decades from 1066. But why he's important is he leaves this big sort of public runestone where he says, I am brilliant and I converted the Danes to Norway and I, ruled Denmark and sorry, I converted the Danes to Christianity and I ruled part of Norway and I was very important. Harald Bluetooth, actually, we Harald Bluetooth is always one of my favorites because his name, HB, his initials, the runes for that we all have on our modern smartphones
Uh,
because that's Bluetooth. That's where that comes from. It's this idea of connections and bringing people together. But yeah, I mean, these decades are significant and important, and we see how interconnected these histories are. So, after Harold Bluetooth, we have Sven Forkbeard, who does conquer England initially. He then dies very soon afterwards. I think he only lasts 5 weeks on the English throne. And eventually, after some more toing and throwing his son Canute ends up on the English throne until his death in 1035. And so that's the context for what happens sort of 3 decades later by the time we get to 1066.
Now the second ending. This is 200 years later.
Mm.
It's a first time I've confronted it. The Battle of Largs. This is the King of Scotland, the King Alexander III of Scotland, and King Haakon IV of Norway. Battle on the beach. And what's at hand?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting one. I grew up knowing quite a lot about the Battle of Largs simply because my dad was born on the Isle of Bute, which is just down the coast, sort of and over the water from Largs. And but the Battle of Largs, I think, is sort of one of the really interesting unsung events of sort of the twilight of the Viking Age, maybe we'll say. So at this point, there are huge numbers of Norse settlers, but by this time we wouldn't even call them settlers. It's just Norse people living in the Western Isles. So, the Hebrides coming down the Clyde Islands all the way to the Isle of Man. So it's a very Norse culturally inflected part of the British Isles. And King Haakon in Norway is the top dog there at this point, and so he wants to keep hold of them. But the problem is that King Alexander, as you say, of Scotland also wants to have them. And so the Battle of Largs, well, essentially it's a series of skirmishes. It's fought at the start of October on the Scottish mainland. And the reason it's so interesting is that when we think about, okay, well, what defines the Viking Age? So much of what defines the Viking Age is going on in the context of the Battle of Largs. So there's raiding, there's really nasty raiding that goes on from the Norse side in particular. It's the fact that they want to kind of keep control or gain control. There's a lot of cultural tension at this point from the sort of like that highest political level. Now, what happens though is fairly inconclusive. We're not talking about something like the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harald Hardrada is killed a couple of centuries earlier. The winter comes, the storms are really bad. So King Haakon of Norway heads up to Orkney, sort of off the northern coast of Scotland, which is still very much Norse controlled. And there he dies. He's not expecting to die. He's expecting to start the campaign again come the spring, but he dies. And so these Western Isles pass to Scotland. And so we see this real shift at that point for the death of one way of life in a way, the start of the other. But of course, all those people of Norse Scandinavian heritage who've always lived in those islands, or certainly for the last few hundred years, are still there. So again, it's not this sort of definite dividing line between one era and another. It's never that simple, really. Well, very rarely that simple when you look on the ground at ordinary people's lives.
Professor Eleanor Barraclough, Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. The Viking Age closed over time or didn't close because it's still with us. Everybody who knows Lord of the Rings well knows the Viking world. We're talking about a language and a time that's magical. However, there's also what I find in Eleanor's closing remarks, a sadness to it, because the world ended. And when did it end is the story we're now approaching. Eleanor, where is Herjolfsnes?
So Herjolfsnes is right at the southern tip of Greenland. And Greenland, for me, is one of the most fascinating parts of Norse Viking Age history. It's the bit that I think I love the most. I've spent a lot of time researching out there. It's very wild, it's very remote still, but it also means there's a lot still to see. There's whole churches still standing, there's farmsteads, you can really get a sense of what it was like. Herjolfsnes was one of the first places to be settled. So the Norse essentially start to settle parts of the west coast of Greenland under Eric the Red, who's sort of outlawed from Iceland for killings and ends up spending 3 years of his outlawry in Greenland, coming back, fetching his relatives and his friends and going out and settling. This is around 985. So again, we're heading up to that first millennium date again. So Herjolfsnes is settled then. Herjolfsnes is also one of the last places to stop being settled, to stop having Norse people living there. And it's really interesting because the permafrost and the ice that traditionally surrounded, the coast of Greenland, although, increasingly not, it meant that huge amounts of organic material survived from the Norse settlement of Greenland in ways that we don't really see in many other places. And in the case of Herjolfsnes, we have a graveyard. And in the graveyard, we have the bodies and the clothes of many of the last inhabitants or the last generations of inhabitants of Norse Greenland. And this takes us all the way up into the early 15th century.
And the clothing is not associated with high status people.
Not at all, no. So it's made of a type of fabric that they called rathmaul or wadmal, we might say, which is, quite a coarse woolen garment, very good for keeping out the wind and the wet. Somewhere like Greenland, that would have really mattered. And in the book, I hone in on one garment. It's a woman's dress, and it's been mended, during its lifetime of wear, possibly during her lifetime if it belonged to her. It's been patched up, and you find this in these graves that the clothes are patched up again and again. These are, yes, by this point, not high status people. And by this point, they have lost, it seems, a lot of their connections to the rest of the world that they were once part of, this Norse diaspora that stretched, certainly to the Scandinavian mainland, but also beyond, further east. And so you find this dress, and for the last time, it's pulled over the head of this woman who's now died. And in fact, this very poignant detail, it rips when they're putting it on her for the last time. There's a rip that isn't mended. And for me, that's one of those very personal details that really sort of gets you. It's very hard to forget a detail like that once you read it. And she's buried in this dress. And it's hard to date exactly, but we're talking, somewhere in the first part, probably, of the 15th century. And what's fascinating, though, is someone must have buried her, or people must have buried her, but she's one of the last people to be buried there. No one's buried above her. And so that begs the question, well, what happened to those very last people? And this is one of these great unsolved mysteries of those dying days of the Norse world.
It's getting colder. There's a climate change that made Greenland possible and then made Greenland not possible.
Mm.
And Eric the Red, a wonderful salesman, you know, if the story is accurate, he named it Greenland because he thought it would encourage settlers.
Yeah.
Very clever. Do we accept that as a real story? I've always thought it was too clever for it sounds so modern.
It does, doesn't it? It is in one of the sagas. So there's two sagas that focus particularly on Greenland and then their expeditions to the edge of North America. And it's there. It says Eric named it Greenland in the hope that people would settle there. The thing is, the areas they settled in, particularly where Eric, I mean, I've been to where Eric's farmstead probably was. It's green, it's lush in the summer. The problem is the summers are very short and the winters are very long and very hard. And for people who essentially would have sort of survived on a mixture of agriculture and hunting, those long winters, they were really on that very edge of what was habitable in terms of their cultural norms and practices.
There are photographs and illustrations throughout Eleanor's book, but two wooden figures here attached to the Greenlanders who departed. One, the giant figure, wooden figure. These are two Norse Greenlanders. And then the other, more diminutive, clearly looks like a man bear and a woman tending to him. Were these child's toys?
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer. Certainly, there are little figures from all across the Norse world that do seem to have been child toys, and for me, those are some of the most poignant and emotionally sort of affecting, artifacts. These ones, yes, possibly. What's interesting is that they seem to have been carved by the non-Norse people, the ancestors of today's Greenlanders, who were also living on the west coast of Greenland at this time. And very slowly, as you say, the temperatures are getting colder, there's more ice. These Arctic people, who are very well adapted to these cold conditions, are moving further down that west coast as it's becoming more habitable for them. But at the same time, the Norse culture is finding it harder and harder. But at a point, the two meet, probably sort of middle of the 13th century, something like that. And it's possible that these two figures were carved by the Inuit inhabitants of Greenland, but they are depicting that dress style that's very typical of the Norse Greenlanders and that we know from the dresses and other garments that are found preserved, as was in the permafrost in Herjolfsnes in the graveyard.
One more mystery. It's at the close of your book, and I circled it asking myself, ask Eleanor. The last surviving reports I read, Eleanor, via Iceland are a witch burning that took place in 1407 and a wedding that took place in 1408. Witch burning? What is,
Oh,
30 seconds. What were they trying to hold off the cold? Is that why?
it has been suggested. So when you get the witch trials later on, there's an economist called Emily Oslo who says, look, there are more witch burnings and the temperature is getting colder. Are these two things connected? But what's fascinating, this witch is a man. He's called Kolgrimr, and it's said that he seduces someone. She's called Steinun, and she's married. He seduces her through witchcraft, and so he's burned as a result of this. And then it says, and she was never the same, and she died afterwards too.
Eleanor Barraclough, Embers of the Hands, the Viking Age. I'm John Batchelor.